Hello, and welcome to a video lecture for Mr. Mosier's 8th grade U.S. History class. Today's video lecture is about a document analysis that we were doing in class. So this is to help students who may have been absent from class to kind of look at how we were able to analyze two primary source documents looking at the story of the Trail of Tears. And so that's going to be sort of the topic that we're going to be looking at here today. And again, we're going to be looking at two documents that describes what happened at the Trail of Tears to give us a better understanding of using some of these historical thinking skills that we've been working on in class. The Cherokee were one of several tribes that will be removed from the American Southeast and the upper Northwest in the early 1800s as part of the Indian Removal Act in the early 1800s. And the Cherokee are found in what we would call today northern Georgia. Northern and western Georgia is where the tribe traditionally held their civilization and their society. So to give us a little better understanding about the Cherokee and kind of the events leading up to the Trail of Tears, it's very important for us to put things into historical context. This is the historical thinking skill we call contextualization. History doesn't happen in a vacuum. There are things that happen leading up to the event and even things that happen after the event. So it's very important for us as historians to put things into historical context, and so we use the historical thinking skill of contextualization to help us put this in the proper framework. Timelines can be a very useful tool for us in putting things into contextualization because it allows us to see the events that led up to the event we're looking and specifically studying, and also the events that led up afterwards. So the Cherokee's first major peaceful interactions with the United States takes place in 1785, where the United States government, and this is kind of still at the time of the Articles of Confederation, where the U.S. government and the Cherokee establish a peaceful relation. They formalize a treaty that sort of sets the boundaries of the Cherokee Nation in what would be today called northern and western Georgia. In 1796, now we have a new constitution and we have a new president. George Washington initiates what we call a civilization program among the Cherokees. The idea was we are going to try and turn the Cherokees into Americans by having them become farmers, like a lot of the plantation farmers there in the South. And this actually goes through several different iterations, and over time the Cherokee begin to actually adopt a lot of American traditions and culture. They include a written language. They have towns and communities that are established and places of public squares. They're really beginning to kind of take on some of the similarities, at least, of the Americans that were living alike around them. In 1802, Georgia agrees to take some of its land and gives it to the United States with the promise that the Georgia lands will remain part within the state. So at the time, Georgia kind of creeped all the way out in today what we call Mississippi, and they decided to kind of reset their boundaries, and so they kind of gave up a lot of their western territory that would become part of Mississippi to the United States, really as kind of a place for these other native tribes, including the Cherokees, but also you have the Chickasaws and the Choctaws and the Creeks that are living in that region as well. So Georgia kind of agrees to give up some of that land basically to the federal government, really as an idea of we're going to give this land to these native tribes, the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Creeks. That's going to be kind of their area, their residency. In 1808 and 1810, we start seeing the very first signs of Cherokee migration to lands west of the Mississippi. So the Louisiana Purchase has happened. People are starting to move to places like Louisiana and Arkansas and Missouri. So we see some Cherokee kind of taking advantage of that opportunity of going to the west as well. In 1820, the Cherokees become one of the most civilized tribes. So this, remember, started first in 1796 under President George Washington, and you start seeing this huge effort of civilization. And there's really what we call five civilized tribes: the Creeks, the Chickasaw, the Seminole, the Choctaw, and the Cherokee. And we use the term civilized in air quotes because they are beginning to adopt a lot of American traditions and culture and way of life. And so they're owning farms. They're even in the South as plantations. They're actually owning slaves as well. In 1828, Andrew Jackson, kind of a war hero from the War of 1812, becomes president, and he is elected and declares his support for a policy that becomes known as the Indian removal policy. The idea is that we're going to take Native American people and push them off their lands and push them out to the western territories to open up that space for American farmers. In 1828, Georgia extends its power over the Cherokee Nation and basically makes Cherokee law illegal. So the state government of Georgia sort of steps in and says, we are going to take over this land right in here, because this is all Cherokee land up here to the north, and you have the Creeks and the Choctaws here further to the west and south. Georgia law basically gets passed and says, we're taking over this land, we're taking over this territory, and we are going to nullify Cherokee laws, basically saying Cherokee law doesn't exist. Now Georgia law is the only law, and you no longer have any rights as Cherokee. In 1832, the Cherokee take their case to the United States Supreme Court, right, the highest court in the land, saying Georgia can't do this. They can't nullify our laws. They can't tell us how we live our lives. We are a separate nation. We are a separate country that were given these boundaries under the U.S. government, under these treaties. Georgia can't just step in and say, hey, you don't exist anymore. We're taking you over. And the Supreme Court actually agreed in a case known as Worcester versus Georgia, and says, yeah, the Cherokee have the right to control their own destiny. They have a right to have their own laws. They're a separate nation. Georgia, you can't step in and take them over. But Jackson maybe or maybe not have said, you know, the court may have passed the ruling, now let's see them enforce it. Nobody wanted to really try and enforce this Supreme Court case, especially the Georgians who wanted the Cherokees' land, and the President of the United States also didn't want to support it as well, because he favored basically Cherokee removal, the Indian Removal Act. So for many Cherokee, they kind of began seeing kind of the writing on the wall, that they went to the Supreme Court for help. The court said, yeah, you have the right, but the state government of Georgia is not going to listen to the court. The U.S. President is going to enforce the law here. And so you have quite a few Cherokees beginning to say, you know what, we just need to get out of here. Our Georgia neighbors are becoming very, very hostile, and we best just maybe sign a treaty and just get out of Dodge. So the Treaty of New Dakota is signed that basically provides removal of the Cherokees to land west of the Mississippi. This group is led by a Cherokee chief named John Ross. And then there's this big protesting as well that tries to prevent this treaty from taking place. So John Ross actually doesn't want to be part of this treaty. He says, we don't have anything with this. This is our land. This is our ancestral homelands. So Chief John Ross says, we're not going to move. We're staying put. So about 2,000 Cherokee actually voluntarily decide to sign the Treaty of New Dakota and leave. But you have 15,000, vast majority of them saying, no, we're not leaving here. In 1838, the U.S. government steps in and says, no, you got to leave. So about 7,000 U.S. federal troops are sent into Cherokee land and basically at gunpoint drive the Cherokee out of their lands and push them west into what becomes known as Indian Territory. About 4,000 Cherokee die. They do this in like the dead of winter. It's horrible traveling. They don't have enough supplies and food. Many of them die of hunger and the elements of being in the cold and starvation. So 4,000 die, which creates the name we call here the Trail of Tears, which is why it's known as the Trail of Tears. So we're going to be looking at two particular documents. One is a document of Andrew Jackson, and this is a copy here of Andrew Jackson. So if you want to pause the video at this time so that you can kind of read through and look over the documents, and then resume playing here when you finish looking at the document. So the very first thing we have to do when looking at a document is we have to source it. So the sourcing question we have today is, what do you already know about President Jackson's feelings about Indian removal? What would you predict that he would say in his speech? So if we're looking at kind of the source and knowing what we know about Andrew Jackson from our timeline, we know that Andrew Jackson was very much in favor of Indian removal. So most likely in this document, we could probably safely predict that he's going to say something very positive about Indian removal. And sure enough, that's what's going to be coming here. Second thing is we're looking at contextualization. So we're looking for specific evidence within the document that says, you know, why does Jackson think the United States would have been better off in 1830 than in 1609? And so we look through the document, and there's a section here that kind of stands out, and I have it highlighted. It says, Republic, studded with cities, towns, and prosperous farms, decorated with art and industry. And he's basically laying out that American civilization has greatly improved in almost these 200 years of history. We have cities, we have towns, we have prosperous farms, we have art, we have industry. The people are happy. They are filled with blessings of liberty and civilization and religion. He asks it as almost like a question like, see, we're doing pretty good, right? And that's what he's trying to get across in that particular document. Why does Jackson think the Cherokee will be better off in the Indian Territory? So again, we can look at the document for a specific citing of evidence, and we can see a line that says, the United States will pay to send the natives to a land where they may live long and possibly survive as a people. So he's talking here about the Cherokee surviving, right? That they're going to survive as a people. If they don't go, then that means they're not going to survive, which means they might die out. So he's kind of basically laying this out as saying this is a good thing we're doing, right? We're helping them out. And he goes, can it be cruel when this government offers to purchase the Indians' land and give them a new and extensive territory, pay for their expense of the removal, and support them for their very first year in their new home? How many thousands of other people would gladly embrace this opportunity of moving west under such conditions? So he's basically kind of making an excuse here, saying, see, we're helping them out. We're paying for their forced movement here to the west. We're trying to help them out, and we're even giving them resources for that first year. Why does Jackson think his policy is kind and generous? Well, that kind of goes back. He said, we are doing something that we normally wouldn't do to anybody else. For all these other pioneers and mountain men and other people that are going west, the government's not helping them out. We're helping the Native Americans out. We're paying for their forced removal. How nice of us to do all this. See, we're being so nice. And another paragraph down below, he talks about we're trying to save them from utter annihilation. The government kindly offers him a new home and proposes to pay the whole expense of his removal and settlement. So here, Jackson's laying an argument saying we are trying to save the Cherokee from utter annihilation. Here's the second document we're going to be looking at by Elias Boudinot. I, again, like you to pause the video at this moment and kind of read through the document, and then we're going to kind of go through and talk through together on how to source and contextualize this particular document. So go ahead and pause. Okay, welcome back. Let's go ahead and look through here this document by Elias Boudinot. Again, we want to source the document. Who is this person, and what do you think they'll have to say about Indian removal? So if we look at the sourcing information from the document, we find out that Elias was a Cherokee who actually supported Indian removal. So they're part of that minority that we looked at in our timeline activity. And so we could probably safely predict that Elias is probably going to come out in support of Indian removal. And this document is probably trying to support and convince others like Chief Ross, who's leading the resistance of removal, that why removal is such a good idea. So this is a letter written to Chief John Ross, who's kind of that resistance leader, saying, no, we're not going to leave our lands. So what was life like for the Cherokee and the Georgia according to Boudinot? And so really right away, two things jump out. It says they are wretched and see the misery. Definitely paints a pretty bad picture of what life is like in Georgia from the viewpoint of Elias, of what the Cherokee are living under. That things are pretty bleak, all right? If someone is wretched, that's not a good thing. That means that they're pretty big time suffering. Someone's going through misery, that's not a good situation to be in. So we can pretty much safely say by looking at these two specific phrases in the document that Elias is painting a picture that things in Georgia, in the Cherokee Nation, not doing very well. We're not really too excited about our life and what's happening there. What does Boudinot hope to help happen if the Cherokees move out west? Again, we can look specifically at the document. I have a specific phrase or line highlighted which says, our people may finally rise from their very ashes to become prosperous and happy and a credit to our race. So here Elias is trying to say, if we move west, things will get better. We will have a space to provide opportunity and prosperity and to get out of the situation that views to be kind of a very negative thing. So some things we can kind of think about when we look here at this particular two documents. Some questions for you to kind of think on is, why did Jackson and or Whatnot think Indian removal was the best interest of the Cherokee? And do you believe them? Do they sound sincere or believable in these documents? How do you think other people at their time thought that Indian removal was reasonable? So why do you think people kind of justified or rationalized Indian removal? And then how do you think attitudes have changed or stayed the same since the 1830s? So these are some things that we kind of looked at and talked about today in our lesson for the Indian Removal Act, and looking at specifically the story of the Trail of Tears, and looking at kind of the rationalization that begins to take place on why Native Americans are being moved from their lands to different places further west. And this is going to be a continual story as we look at other aspects of westward expansion, where we're going to see Native Americans being continually removed from their lands onto different spaces. Kind of this idea of out of sight, out of mind. Remove them to some place that they're kind of out of the way to the other groups coming out and settling to the west. So again, thank you for listening, and if you have any questions, please make sure you come talk to me.